Agatha Raisin and the Body at the Book Club of Carsely. Good evening and welcome, dear friends. Agatha Raisin never expected the quiet Carsely Book Club to end with a body slumped over a half-finished chapter. As she studies the stillness in the room, the overturned teacup, the oddly placed bookmark, she senses something deliberate. Who wanted him silent tonight, and why choose a book club to do it? Before Agatha steps into today's mystery, we'd love to know something special from you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments remind us how far these little village tales can travel and how close they bring us all. And if these stories bring you comfort, do subscribe so you never miss a gentle moment with Agatha. So let's begin.
Chapter 1. The Club No One Ever Fights About. Agatha stepped out of her cottage with a calm, unhurried stride, letting the mild Carsely evenings settle around her like a soft shawl. Lanterns glowed along the stone footpath, their warm light brushing the hedges with gentle gold. She breathed in the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from nearby chimneys and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The Carsely Book Club, despite its reputation for harmless bickering, always offered her a small pocket of entertainment, one she would never admit she looked forward to. Tonight, she reminded herself, she was simply going because she had nothing better to do. As she walked, neighbors called out greetings, their voices floating lazily through the dusk. Mrs. Timpson waved from her garden, offering a comment about the weather that drifted away before Agatha could form a reply. A pair of teenagers hurried past, whispering fiercely about something they didn't want overheard. Agatha caught only the tail of their conversation, a sharp name and a hasty "don't tell," which stirred her curiosity more than she wished to admit. She tucked her hands into her coat pockets and continued toward the hall where the meeting was held each month. The village hall glimmered with a soft flicker of candlelight visible through the windows. Inside, she could already hear the rustle of pages, the clatter of teacups, and the low hum of spirited but harmless complaint. Agatha lingered outside for a moment, pretending she needed a breath of fresh air, when in truth she simply enjoyed delaying the ritualistic chaos that awaited her. When she finally stepped inside, the familiar warmth wrapped around her. Members busied themselves arranging chairs, arguing about biscuit placement and debating whether last month's choice had been too gloomy. A book lay on the display table, oddly out of alignment with the others, as though someone had moved it in haste. The detail tugged lightly at Agatha's attention, though she pushed the thought aside with a faint smirk. Her gaze shifted to a man she did not recognize. Leonard Pike, introduced only last week, stood near the back, clutching a book so tightly his knuckles whitened. He darted glances toward the door, then at the table, then at nothing at all. His fingers tugged at the corner of his sleeve, a repeated nervous motion impossible for Agatha to ignore. She watched him for a moment, more intrigued than she cared to reveal. A whispered argument drifted from the far side of the room. Agatha could catch only fragments. "You promised, not tonight. Keep your voice down." She turned slightly, pretending to examine the biscuit tray, though her ears followed every word. By the time she located the source, the speakers had separated, leaving nothing but the faint echo of tension behind. Settling into her usual chair, Agatha allowed herself one more sweeping glance around the hall. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, comfortably familiar, yet she sensed something faintly off-kilter, like a story waiting to tip toward its first unsettling turn. She crossed her legs, folded her hands, and waited for the evening to begin, unaware of how different it would look by the time the final page was turned. The chatter swelled gently as more members drifted in, bringing with them the comforting sense of rain-damp coats and lavender soap. Agatha leaned back and let the atmosphere wash over her, though her gaze continued returning to Leonard. Something about his unease pricked at her instincts, not with fear, but with that restless curiosity she could never quite tame. He shifted again, nearly dropping his book, and cast a quick, apprehensive look toward the misplaced display book. Agatha followed his line of sight, wondering why a simple object should unsettle him so deeply. The room settled at last, leaving Agatha.
Agatha adjusted her seat,
smoothing the edge of her coat as the meeting room slowly filled with the familiar hum of Carsely's book-loving villagers. Chairs scraped, teacups clinked, and the scent of weak lemon biscuits drifted through the warm air. She let her gaze wander across the crowd, noting the usual clusters. The Timpson sisters, whispering dramatically as though discussing state secrets. Mr. Fletcher arguing with anyone who would listen about the correct way to interpret last month's mystery novel. And Mrs. Bloxby moving gently among them, offering soft words that smoothed frayed tempers before they could properly unravel. Mrs. Bloxby tapped the table lightly, her signal for calm. "Shall we begin, everyone?" she said, though without any expectation that the room would immediately obey. A few members quieted, others continued chattering until she gave them a kindly but pointed look. Agatha hid a smile. It took a particular kind of patience to shepherd this group, and only Mrs. Bloxby possessed it in abundance. Agatha leaned back, watching as the discussion began in its usual roundabout fashion. Someone complained that the protagonist in their assigned novel behaved unrealistically bold. Another countered that the author's depiction of small village life was perfect, though Agatha privately thought it was far too sanitized. Debates flared over the meaning of a minor character's final line, over whether the ending had been satisfying, over who had borrowed 2 books and returned only 1. It was the kind of harmless chaos that made the Carsely Book Club endearing, even if Agatha would rather be caught in a thunderstorm than admit that aloud. Leonard Pike, however, did not blend into the cozy noise. He sat slightly apart from the others, perched on the edge of his chair as though prepared to bolt. His book remained clenched in his hands, the pages bent under the pressure of his grip. Agatha watched him from beneath lowered lashes, trying to make sense of the man's anxious energy. New members sometimes felt shy, but Leonard's unease carried a sharper edge. He stared at the floor, then at the doorway, then at a man across the room, Gavin Turner, a longtime club member known mostly for his booming laugh and questionable fashion choices. Gavin noticed Leonard's glance and stiffened. A flicker of something unreadable passed between the two men, a taut thread drawn tight enough to hum. Agatha straightened, alert. She couldn't tell whether they knew each other or simply disliked each other on sight, but something in that tension snagged her attention like a loose thread begging to be pulled. A woman behind Agatha murmured a name. She couldn't catch the full word, only the first hollow syllable, and the entire room seemed to pause for a fraction of a breath. Even the rustling pages quieted. But when Agatha turned, searching for the source, the moment had already dissolved back into easy chatter, leaving only the faintest trace of unease behind. Mrs. Bloxby cleared her throat. "Let's, refocus on the book, shall we? Leonard, would you like to—" Her sentence was cut short by a sharp clatter. Every head turned. Leonard's teacup lay on its side, its contents spreading across the table in a pale widening pool. The cup itself rolled once, twice, then stopped at the table's edge, as though catching its breath. No one had touched it. Leonard stared down at the spill, his face draining of color. His hands remained gripped around his book. He hadn't even reached toward the cup. Agatha's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with that familiar, unwelcome thrill she experienced whenever something unusual disrupted the ordinary rhythm of village life. "Oh dear," Mrs. Bloxby said gently, stepping forward with a napkin. "It's all right, just an accident." But Agatha wasn't convinced. Something in Leonard's expression, some mixture of dread and resignation, sent a prickling alertness up her spine. He looked not surprised by the spill, but troubled by it, as though it confirmed something he'd been trying desperately not to admit. Members resumed conversation in soft murmurs, but the cozy atmosphere had shifted. A subtle tension wound itself through the room, quiet but undeniable. Agatha watched Leonard closely, her intuition now fully awake. Whatever was wrong tonight, it hadn't shown itself fully yet, but it was coming, and she could feel it waiting, patient and deliberate. just beneath the surface of this last normal evening.
Chapter 2. A Body Between the Bookshelves. Agatha never liked being the last one to collect her things, yet here she was again, lingering at the close of the Carsely book club meeting. The room hummed with the usual end-of-evening rustle, chairs scraping, papers shuffling, and Mrs. Blocksby thanking everyone with her soft pastoral patience. Agatha moved toward the back bookshelves where she had draped her coat earlier, noting the warm mingling of old book dust and lavender polish. A scent that normally soothed her. Tonight, it merely reminded her she wanted to get home. She stepped between the narrow aisle of shelves and tables and immediately spotted Leonard Pike, still seated at his place. His head was tilted down toward the book he had been gripping all evening. For a fleeting second, Agatha assumed he had drifted off. Poor man, his nerves likely exhausted him. But something in the angle of his arm didn't look right. It hung too loosely at his side, fingers curled unnaturally, as if the effort to hold on had been abruptly abandoned. "Leonard?" she called in a low voice, not wanting to startle him or, more importantly, embarrass herself if he woke with a snort. No movement. She stepped closer. The lantern light above flickered faintly, just enough to reveal a worrying stillness in his posture. Agatha's sharp instincts prickled to life, quick and immediate, slicing through the cozy warmth of the evening. She reached out and gave the edge of his chair a light push. Nothing. Mrs. Blocksby's gentle voice floated from behind her. "Agatha, dear." She stopped mid-sentence, her gasp slicing the air like a cold draft. "Oh, heavens, is he—" Agatha crouched beside Leonard, her breath held tight. She placed 2 fingers lightly against his wrist, expecting a faint pulse, a flutter, anything. But the skin felt cool, too cool. A stillness deeper than sleep settled over the moment, quiet and awful. "He's gone," she said softly, though the words felt foreign, unreal. Within seconds, the remaining book club members swarmed toward the scene. Mrs. Blocksby clutching her shawl, Mr. Green muttering something about shock, and Doris Simpson whispering prayers under her breath. Their voices layered into a rising cloud of confusion, and yet Agatha felt apart from it, anchored in a strange bubble of clarity. She was perfectly fine earlier, Doris insisted, as if volume alone might resurrect him. Quiet? The man looked downright spooked, Mr. Green quipped, though his voice wavered. Agatha's attention narrowed as she noticed a slippery glint between Leonard's fingers. Something thin, pressed tight. She leaned closer. A bookmark, an ordinary-looking strip of cream cardstock, but clutched with such tension that she had to ease his finger slightly to see it. No writing, no decoration, nothing. Plain and unsettling in its simplicity. Odd, she thought. Very odd. Then a scent drifted toward her, faint but unmistakable, sharp, metallic, and too out of place in a cozy community hall filled with biscuits and tea. She inhaled again, slow and deliberate. Not blood, but something she couldn't pinpoint. Something wrong. Before she could examine further, a soft shuffle pricked her ear. A figure slipped through the side door, the one that led to the quiet back corridor. She caught only a shadow, a hurried movement, and the faint clack of a door gently closing. She straightened instantly. "Did anyone see that?" she asked, scanning the room. Mrs. Blocksby shook her head, still pale. "See what?" I saw." The members exchanged uneasy murmurs, but Agatha's mind was already racing. A mysterious exit, a strange scent, a bookmark clenched as if it mattered more than breath. The peaceful book club evening had snapped, silently and suddenly, into something far darker, and Agatha Raisin was already on the trail.
The room had settled into a hushed, uneasy quiet, as though the very books lining the walls were holding their breath. Agatha straightened slowly, her eyes moving from Leonard's still form to the surrounding chaos. The subtle details of the scene called to her like faint bells, each one asking to be noticed, questioned, understood. Her gaze drifted first to the teacup near Leonard's elbow, only it wasn't quite where it should have been. The cup lay on its side, a thin trail of tea snaking toward the edge of the table. Agatha frowned. Leonard hadn't been drinking tea during the meeting. He'd barely touched anything at all.
And yet here was a fresh spill, warm enough to release a small curl of steam. She reached out and touched the tablecloth lightly. Damp, recent. Stranger still was the faint discoloration on the wood beneath, a pale, washed-out stain that didn't look like ordinary tea. It was thinner, almost diluted, as if someone had tampered with the contents or rinsed the cup hastily before it toppled. "Did anyone see him drinking this?" Agatha raised her voice, just enough to break through the murmurs of the villagers. Doris Simpson shook her head vigorously. "Leonard refused biscuits earlier, you know. Said he felt too jittery for sugar." Mr. Green added, "He didn't pour himself any tea when I offered, and I'd remember. He looked like he needed a stiff drink more than anything warm." Agatha lifted the cup carefully, noting the faint scent inside, something herbal, unfamiliar, not the club's usual chamomile blend. Her attention shifted next to Leonard's book. It lay open but slightly off-center, as though placed down hurriedly or nudged at some point. She crouched to inspect it, brushing a few crumbs aside. The book was open to Chapter 14, a section titled The Last Keeper. A single bookmark rested neatly under the right page, but the odd part wasn't the placement. It was the torn, jagged edge of a small paper note tucked beneath it. She eased it free. Handwritten message curved across the scrap in tight, anxious strokes. "Not safe. Must tell someone before..." Before what? That was all. The edge was torn, leaving the sentence unresolved, suspended in dreadful possibility. "Mrs. Bloxby," Agatha murmured, holding up the note, "did Leonard say anything unusual to you tonight?" Mrs. Bloxby hesitated. Agatha saw it clearly, a fleeting pause before her fingers twisted in the fringe of her shawl. "Well, yes, but it didn't seem important at the time. He asked if we could meet privately tomorrow. He looked troubled, but I assumed it was something to do with his settling into the village." "Did he say why he needed the meeting?" "No," she replied softly, "just that it was personal and urgent." Agatha tucked the torn note back into the book, her mind assembling pieces like mismatched puzzle fragments. Leonard had come tonight carrying something heavy. Fear, secrecy, or perhaps guilt. Whatever it was, someone else may have known too. Behind her, a faint clatter drew her attention. She turned to see Mrs. Hodge sniffing around the refreshment table, muttering to herself. "What's missing now?" Agatha asked. "The biscuit tin," Mrs. Hodge declared. "I put it out at the beginning of the meeting. Lovely assortment, too. But look, gone, and not a crumb left." Agatha scanned the tabletop. Indeed, the polished tin was nowhere in sight. Odd, very odd. The book club was many things, scatterbrained, quarrelsome, fond of pastries, but they were not thieves of communal biscuits. "Does anyone remember moving it?" Agatha asked. A chorus of no's answered. She tucked that curious detail away as well. A missing tin, a toppled teacup, a torn note, a man too scared to speak freely. All small things, perhaps, but Agatha Raisin had made a life and a reputation out of knowing that small things often shouted the loudest.
Chapter 3. Whispers Across Carsely. Agatha awoke to the gentle creak of her cottage settling in the early light, a familiar sound that usually comforted her, but this morning felt different. The quiet held an edge, as though the village itself was waiting for something to unfold. She dressed quickly, unable to shake the image of Leonard slumped over the table, his hand wrapped around a torn message that refused to explain itself fully. Outside, Carsely seemed deceptively peaceful. Birds fluttered between chimneys, shop signs clinked softly in the breeze, and the faint smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery.
Yet beneath the surface, the village pulsed with subdued urgency. Whispers trailed behind open doors, and curtains twitched ever so slightly as Agatha passed. Her first stop was the greengrocer's, where Mr. Felton arranged apples in precise rows. Normally, he greeted her with cheerful chatter about the quality of the produce, but today he kept glancing over his shoulder. "Mornin'," Agatha said lightly. He jumped. "Oh, Mrs. Raisin, yes, morning." His voice sounded thin, stretched. Agatha raised an eyebrow. "You look like someone stole your favorite rutabaga." He fumbled an apple and barely caught it. "Just tired. Long night." She leaned one elbow on the counter. "I heard about Leonard Pike, I assume." The tremor in his hand was unmistakable this time. He placed the apple down carefully, as though it might explode. "Terrible thing. Shame, really. But accidents happen. People faint, hit their heads, drink something too strong." "Funny," Agatha interrupted. "No one said it was an accident yet." Mr. Felton fell silent. His throat bobbed once before he forced a brittle smile. "Well, you know how people talk. Anyway, best get on with the day." A quick, nervous pivot. Conversation cut short. Agatha made a note of it in her mind, along with the curious glance she'd caught earlier toward the small drawer behind his counter. It was locked, a tiny silver key protruding from the hole. Mr. Felton rarely kept anything locked. What was so valuable, or dangerous, that he needed to secure it now? She didn't ask. Not yet. Agatha continued down the lane, listening as fragments of gossip drifted past her like loose pages from a book. "He looked ill before the meeting. Not natural, if you ask me. But they said no marks, no struggle. I heard he argued with someone outside." Hints, half-truths, assumptions. A swirl of speculation that both amused and frustrated her. Carsely's talent for embellishment was legendary, yet somewhere in the tangle of stories there was always a thread of truth. At the post office, she encountered Mrs. Hodge, who stood behind the counter with an air of exaggerated calm. Normally delighted to share the freshest rumors, today she seemed oddly restrained. "Morning, Agatha," she said, folding a parcel with unnecessary force. "Dreadful business last night. Dreadful indeed. Did you know Leonard well?" Mrs. Hodge's hands paused for a beat too long. "Not really. Quiet man, odd eyes, always looked like he expected bad news." "Did he speak to anyone yesterday, before the meeting?" For a moment it seemed she might answer. Her mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut. "I'm sure I wouldn't know. People come and go. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must sort these packages." A gossip trail abruptly ended. Another note for Agatha's mental ledger. As she resumed her walk, she mulled over her observations. Some villagers acted unaffected, their lives continuing with steady rhythm. Others seemed shaken to the core, eager to avoid questions. A select few appeared genuinely anxious in a way that had nothing to do with grief. By the time she reached the center of Carsely, Agatha's mind had begun arranging names and details like the early bones of a map. Who spoke to Leonard? Who avoided him? Who seemed frightened now? Not all connections were clear yet, but patterns were beginning to form. Carsely might have carried on this morning, its routines unbroken, its charm intact. But Agatha felt the subtle shift, the almost imperceptible tilt of a story beginning to deepen. Life went on, yes, but not quite the same. Something had stirred beneath the village's calm surface, and Agatha intended to uncover exactly what.
Agatha sat at her kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea, steam curling upward in soft spirals. The quiet inside her cottage helped settle the jumble of impressions she had gathered since morning. She reached for her notebook, the one she used only when something needed proper unraveling. Last night's death, no, she would not call it an accident, deserved more than vague impressions and half-remembered conversations. She clicked her pen, took a slow breath, and began. "Suspect list, draft 1, she wrote. Names came to her quickly at first,
Mr. Felton, Mrs. Hodge, Mrs. Dewey, even that overly dramatic member of the book club who kept insisting Leonard had been perfectly cheerful only moments before his collapse. But cheerful was certainly not the word Agatha would have used. Leonard had looked strained, pale, and desperately uncomfortable, as though every person in the room had been a ticking clock he could hear, but no one else could. She added Mr. Felton first, circling his name. The man had trembled more than a greengrocer arranging apples ought to tremble. His locked drawer lingered in her mind, too neatly ignored to be innocent. She circled his name again for emphasis, the ink pressing deeper into the page with each stroke. Next came Mrs. Hodge, though Agatha hesitated before writing it. The woman loved gossip, but something yesterday had clamped her mouth shut. That wasn't typical secrecy, it was fear. Fear of what? Being implicated? Knowing too much? Agatha scratched a question mark beside her name. Then Mrs. Dewey, who had argued about something in the hallway before the meeting. She had only caught a clipped, frustrated, "You promised," before the door shut. Leonard had emerged moments later, flustered and pink-cheeked. She tapped the pen on the table. Something else tugged at her memory, something small, almost unimportant, yet it insisted on being included. She added, "Unknown footprint, Leonard's house," and underlined it slowly. She had noticed it earlier that morning, pressed faintly into the gravel outside his gate. Too large to be Leonard's, too deep for someone merely passing by. Whoever stood there had lingered. A soft knock pulled Agatha from her thoughts. She opened the door to find Mrs. Blocksby standing on the step, hands clasped tightly in front of her, face drawn with worry. Her usual calm warmth seemed strained, as though she had spent the night wrestling with thoughts she couldn't bear to voice. "Agatha, may I come in?" "Of course." Agatha stepped aside, ushering her towards the table. "You look as though someone stole your hymn book." "I'm all right, dear. Just unsettled." They sat. Miss Blocksby smoothed the fabric of her skirt, staring down at her hands. "I should have spoken to you last night. I meant to. There was something Leonard said earlier that bothered me." Agatha leaned in slightly. "Go on." "He came to the vicarage yesterday afternoon, asked to speak privately. He told me there was something wrong, but wouldn't explain. He asked if we could meet after the book club. He sounded frightened, Agatha, truly frightened." "What sort of wrong?" Agatha pressed. Mrs. Blocksby shook her head. "He wouldn't say. And now," her voice cracked, "now he's gone and I feel as though I failed him." Agatha reached across the table, placing a hand gently over hers. "You didn't fail him. If Leonard was hiding something dangerous, he may have been trying to protect you." Mrs. Blocksby nodded, but her eyes held a quiet guilt she tried and failed to hide. Something more weighed on her, something she wasn't ready to admit. When she left a few minutes later, Agatha closed the door slowly, mind racing. She returned to her notebook and wrote Mrs. Blocksby at the bottom of the list. Not as a suspect, not truly, but as someone holding a piece of the truth she wasn't sharing. She circled the name only once, hesitating, then glanced at the earlier names marked with heavier lines. Carsely was full of secrets, and Leonard, it seemed, had stumbled into the middle of them. Agatha tapped her pen, looked at the list of circled names, and felt the investigation begin to sharpen. The threads were there. Now she needed to untangle them.
Chapter 4. A bookmark that should not exist. Agatha approached Leonard's cottage with a cautious step, the kind she reserved for places carrying more questions than comfort. The small stone house sat slightly apart from its neighbors, tucked behind an overgrown hedge in a patch of wild rosemary that brushed against her coat as she passed. The morning sun struggled to warm the place, leaving it in a cool pocket of shadow, as though even the light hesitated to intrude. She tried the front door. Locked. Sensible, but inconvenient. Circling around, she found a back window partly cracked open. Only someone deeply flustered or distracted would forget to secure a window at night, another sign Leonard's thoughts had been in turmoil. With a careful push, it slid up just enough for her to slip through. The air inside felt stale, as if time had stopped the moment he'd walked out for the book club meeting. Agatha paused, taking in the room. Papers littered the table, corners curled from handling. Several books lay splayed open on the floor, forming a loose path toward the narrow hallway.
A mug sat unwashed on the counter, its cold contents forming a dark line along the rim. Nothing here was careless. Leonard had been working frantically. She stepped closer to the table. Notes covered in cramped handwriting filled several loose sheets. Some phrases made sense, like meeting, must confirm, not safe, but others were riddles of half-formed ideas. She spotted a familiar blue fragment among them, a torn bookmark. Carefully, she lifted it. The edge matched the one Leonard had clutched at the meeting. He must have broken it in haste or panic. So what had he been marking? A glance toward the scattered books answered that. One lay open with a ripped inner page, as if someone had torn something out. Another had been annotated heavily, underlining key lines with shaky strokes. Agatha crouched down and picked up a book lying nearest to her. A thin layer of dust lined its spine, except for the section where someone's fingers had gripped recently. Inside, a burned corner of a letter was tucked between pages. Only a piece of it remained, singed into a triangular shape. The writing was faded but legible. Not trust. Watching. Be careful. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone. No signature, no dates, just a warning swallowed by fire and fear. Agatha stood and scanned the room again, something nagging at her. There were drawers beneath the main table, 3 of them. One was ajar, filled with envelopes and receipts. The second was empty, but intact. The third, however, was gone entirely. Only its metal slides remained, stretched like skeletal arms. She crouched again, running her finger along the smooth metal. Someone had forcibly removed the drawer, not merely taken something from it. Why remove the whole thing unless its contents were too large or too damning to be left behind? Her eyes shifted toward the far wall, where a large corkboard hung unevenly. Several pins were stuck into it. The most held nothing. A map of Carsely lay tacked at the center. Leonard had circled the village twice with thick black ink, the lines jagged, almost frantic. He'd drawn smaller circles over specific homes, shop corners, and the village green. Agatha leaned closer. A pin marked the book club's meeting hall, another the vicarage, and another, she swallowed, her own cottage. Whatever Leonard had discovered, it touched every part of Carsely. She scanned the rest of his notes, careful not to disturb too much. One page held a short list of names. Some she recognized from the book club, others belonged to villagers she seldom spoke to. One name, however, had been underlined repeatedly, then scratched out, then rewritten even darker. She made a mental note of it, but didn't say the name out loud, not in this silent room where the air felt thick with someone's unfinished fear. Agatha folded a few documents neatly, the burned letter fragment, the notes with circled phrases, and a small map sketched in pencil, and slipped them into her coat pocket. She would analyze them later, away from this claustrophobic space where Leonard's last hours seemed to echo. Before leaving, she took one last look around. The missing drawer, the torn bookmark, the circled map, the burned letter. Each clue felt like a faint heartbeat in an unraveling mystery. Agatha stepped out of the cottage, closing the window behind her, and breathed deeply. Leonard had been searching for something, or someone, and whatever he had found, or nearly found, had pushed him into dangerous territory. She walked away, the weight of the documents pressing gently against her side, each page whispering that this was only the beginning. Agatha returned to her cottage and set the carefully gathered papers on the table, spreading them with deliberate care. The morning light slanted through the window, casting long, golden streaks across the notebook pages and the small, torn bookmark. She picked up the fragment, noting the faint impressions along its surface. The blue cardstock was smooth and unassuming, but something about it drew her eye. She turned it over, then placed a blank sheet of paper atop it, pressing a pencil gently to shade across the surface. Lines emerged in pale graphite, indentations. Someone had written on the page above where the bookmark rested. Agatha leaned in closer, tracing each depression with a fingertip. Words formed slowly. A name, Harold Craven, and below it, part of an address that seemed familiar but distant. End Farm,
Old Lane. The final letters were smudged or incomplete, yet enough remained for her to imagine the rest. Agatha set the pencil down, her mind ticking. Harold Craven? She didn't recognize the name from Carsely. And an abandoned farm on Old Lane? That property had been empty for years, left to ivy and the occasional wandering goat. Why would Leonard mark it so urgently, so carefully, if it had no connection to anyone in the village? The sense of unanswered questions prickled at her, sharp and insistent. She folded the bookmark and tucked it near her notebook, only to hear the soft creak of the door opening behind her. Mrs. Bloxby stepped inside, hands clasped tightly in front of her, face pale beneath its usual calm. Agatha looked up. "Ah, Mrs. Bloxby," she said lightly, though she noticed immediately the tremor in the woman's hands as she reached for the edge of the table. "I've found something in Leonard's things. A bookmark, a name, an address." She showed it to her, careful not to disturb the faint impressions. Mrs. Bloxby's eyes widened sharply, the color draining from her cheeks. That shouldn't exist," she murmured. Her voice trembled and her fingers flexed nervously. Where did you see that?" "In his papers at the cottage," Agatha replied calmly, watching her closely. "Harold Craven. End Farm. Does that mean anything to you?" Mrs. Bloxby's gaze dropped to the floor. She shook her head, but not convincingly. I don't know him. I haven't been there. I swear, Agatha, I know nothing." Her hands, still trembling, clutched at her shawl as if it could anchor her to some imagined stability. Agatha studied her, noting the subtle fear that lingered beneath the words. It wasn't guilt about Leonard. Mrs. Bloxby had been careful, attentive, but it was fear all the same. Fear of something hidden, something older than the night of events. Agatha tucked the bookmark away and opened Leonard's book again, scanning the adjacent pages. Something else caught her eye. A shelf in the corner of the club's library had a conspicuous gap. One book, a plain hardback that normally rested among the rows of mysteries, was missing. Not misplaced, not borrowed, it was gone entirely. The absence felt deliberate, and the empty space seemed to echo with Leonard's urgency. "Mrs. Bloxby," Agatha said quietly, "this missing book, have you seen it anywhere?" The vicar's wife shook her head again, slower this time, but the corners of her mouth pressed thinly. I don't know. It was on the shelf yesterday, I think." "Yes, it was there." Agatha nodded, committing the detail to memory. The abandoned farm, the unfamiliar name, and the missing book, they were fragments of a larger puzzle. Leonard had uncovered something worth hiding, something worth fearing. And Mrs. Bloxby's reaction told her that the secret's roots ran deeper than the night of his death. Agatha leaned back, letting the quiet settle around her. The village seemed calm from her window, but beneath the placid surface, currents of hidden truths were flowing. She had a thread to follow now, and she would. End Farm, Harold Craven, and a missing book. The story was only just beginning to unfold.
Chapter 5. The Shadows Behind the Farmhouse. Agatha parked at the edge of Old Lane, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes. The abandoned farm lay ahead, its timbers weathered, paint peeling, and windows like dull eyes staring at her approach. Vaughans crept along the walls, and the gate hung askew, squeaking gently as a breeze nudged it. Even from the road, the place smelled faintly of damp earth and disuse, yet beneath that was a sharper note, something faintly familiar that made her pause. She stepped closer, surveying the ground. Footprints encircled the doorway, the mud soft enough to reveal fresh impressions. Someone had been here recently. Agatha crouched, tracing the indentations with a gloved finger. The soles were small, deliberate, moving back and forth, as if the intruder had been searching carefully, perhaps waiting, perhaps hiding. The thought tightened her chest with anticipation. Pushing the door open, she entered the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the slanted beams of light, but the scene inside suggested human activity far more recent than the faded surfaces implied. Boxes lay toppled, their contents spilling onto the floor. Pages torn from a book fluttered against the rough boards, their edges ragged, ink faded in uneven streaks. Agatha picked one up gingerly, scanning the fragment. It was a narrative of village history. Familiar names, streets, a reference to events she had only heard of in passing. Leonard had clearly been trying to uncover connections, fragments of something overlooked. Her gaze fell to a teacup on a small, chipped table near the back corner. Unlike the thick layer of dust covering the windowsill and beams, the cup looked freshly handled. A faint smear of tea clung to the rim, and the faint aroma reminded her uncomfortably of the book club room, the same herbal blend she had noticed on the overturned cup that night. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Leonard had brought the scent of Carsely here, carried it with him as he searched. Agatha's eyes moved across the room, noting subtle disarray. Drawers left open, papers stacked hastily, a small pile of letters half bound together with string. She reached for one, carefully lifting the top envelope. It was addressed, neatly typed, but the stamp was missing. Clearly, it had never been sent. The recipient's name was unfamiliar to her, but the air of importance was undeniable. Someone had prepared communication, but withheld it. Why? And did Leonard know about it? She crouched, examining the floor near a fallen box. More pages lay scattered, some with scribbled notes in Leonard's handwriting. Lines underlined, passages circled, evidence of a mind methodically piecing together something hidden within Carsely's past. Agatha imagined him here, moving carefully among the shadows, reading, connecting, perhaps realizing that what he sought carried danger, even in a village as quaint as their own. A sudden creak from above made her pause. The loft above appeared empty, yet the wooden floor groaned as if it remembered the weight of someone who had walked carefully across it only yesterday. Agatha's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. Leonard's trail was visible, almost tactile, and each object in the room, teacup, torn pages, the unsent envelope, felt like a breadcrumb leading to the heart of a mystery. She collected a few of the pages and the envelope, tucking them into her coat. A glance back at the teacup reminded her that small details often carried greater truths than they seemed to hold at first glance. Leonard had been meticulous, fearful, and determined. Whatever he was searching for, it was tied closely to the history and hidden tensions of Carsely itself. Her notebook would need these pages, these hints, to unravel what no one else seemed willing or able to see. And Agatha Raisin was already prepared to follow the trail wherever it led.
Back in the quiet of her cottage, Agatha spread the collected documents across the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the window, but the warmth failed to reach the knot of unease coiling in her stomach. She placed the pages from Leonard's cottage beside the fragments from the abandoned farm and began to compare them methodically, line by line, detail by detail. Immediately a pattern emerged. Names repeated, most prominently the one scrawled on the bookmark, Harold Craven. It appeared in letters, in torn book pages, and in hastily scribbled notes that Leonard had hidden among ordinary text. Agatha's finger traced the name across several papers, each instance marked differently, underlined, circled, even highlighted with careful shading. Whoever Harold Craven was, he had been central to something hidden in Carsely, something significant enough to warrant secrecy and caution. She glanced at the torn fragments of letters from the farm. One, partially burned, hinted at an old dispute over property, mentions of deeds, past promises broken, and resentment lingering like smoke. Another referred to a lost communication that had never reached its intended recipient. Piecing these clues together, Agatha began to see a web of betrayal stretching back years, concealed beneath the placid surface of the village she thought she knew. Her hand rested on a page from Leonard's notes. One line had been torn out entirely, leaving a blank gap in the otherwise meticulous record. Agatha frowned. Why remove it?
Was it intentional, a safeguard for whoever wished to keep the secret buried? Or had Leonard done it himself in haste, a precautionary measure before the danger reached him? The uncertainty pressed on her chest like a weight. She leaned back, absorbing the implications. Leonard had not stumbled onto a trivial matter. This was significant, tied to property, old disputes and lost letters, and it was clear he had begun to connect the dots. Someone had wanted these threads hidden well enough that even the villagers she trusted most might not have been aware of the full scope. The intensity of the mystery sharpened Agatha's senses. She moved to the window, glancing over the quiet lane below. Something or someone made her pause. A shadow flickered behind the hedge across the street, remaining just long enough to catch her eye before retreating. She leaned closer, scanning the path, but the figure was gone. Not a leaf moved, not a step sounded. Her pulse quickened. Leonard's danger had not ended with him. Someone was still watching, perhaps waiting to see what she would uncover. Agatha's mind raced. The repeated name, the torn page, the unsent letters, all pointed toward someone in Carsely with a vested interest in keeping the past buried. And now, with her own movements observed, it was clear that her inquiries were no longer private. The village's cozy facade concealed a far more tense, calculated undercurrent. She gathered the pages again, stacking them neatly, but her thoughts spun faster than her fingers could move. Leonard's research, the farm, the bookmark, the missing book from the club, everything intersected. Carsely was not simply a village of idle chatter and quiet streets. It was a place where old resentments and unspoken agreements festered, leaving dangerous consequences for anyone daring to investigate. Agatha tapped the table lightly, a rhythm of thought. The clues were all here, embedded in plain sight, yet requiring patience, caution, and a keen eye to unravel. Whoever had followed her had not yet revealed their intent, but their presence was a warning. She would have to move carefully. Rising from the table, she drew a deep breath and glanced toward the door. The shadows outside seemed longer, darker. One thing was certain. Leonard had uncovered something he shouldn't have, and Agatha Raisin now understood that pursuing it would put her directly in the path of the same danger. Her mind was already planning her next steps. This wasn't merely a village mystery anymore. It was a puzzle with real stakes, and Agatha intended to solve it, no matter how many shadows waited to intervene.
Chapter 6. Trouble in Plain Sight. Agatha walked briskly down the narrow lane, the crisp afternoon air bracing against her cheeks. She approached the house of the villager who had drawn her attention over the past day, a thin, anxious man named Cedric Mallory, known for his precise gardening and even more precise avoidance of uncomfortable conversations. Today, she intended to disrupt that pattern. Cedric opened the door hesitantly, as if expecting trouble, and Agatha stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The small sitting room smelled faintly of tea and dust, and the curtains hung low, dimming the light. Cedric's hands fidgeted with a folded newspaper on the table. "Cedric," she began, her voice calm but insistent, "we need to talk about Leonard Pike." His eyes darted toward the floor. I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Raisin. I didn't see anything unusual." Agatha leaned against the doorframe, surveying the room with a practiced eye. The neatness of the place betrayed unease. Everything slightly off, just enough to suggest someone hiding more than papers. She noticed a folded letter, partially hidden behind a cushion, its edges peeked out, and her curiosity flared. Someone had deliberately hidden it, yet the attempt was sloppy. "Cedric," she pressed gently, "I know you were at the meeting yesterday. You were uneasy, watching Leonard, listening to conversations. Something's bothering you, and I need to know what it is." He swallowed hard, glancing at his clasped hands. His fingers trembled slightly, but Agatha's attention was caught by something else. A dark bruise curving along his forearm, partly hidden beneath the cuff of his sleeve. She raised an eyebrow. "Did that happen recently?" she asked lightly, letting her gaze linger. He flinched, then nodded reluctantly. Yes,
Yes, just yesterday. Agatha's mind raced. Bruises didn't appear spontaneously. This was evidence of a struggle, perhaps even intimidation. She took a step closer, lowering her voice to match the intimacy of the room. Cedric, I need you to tell me everything you saw. Even the smallest detail matters. He exhaled shakily. I saw Leonard just before the book club. He was with someone in the alley behind the bakery. They spoke in hushed voices, hurried, tense. I couldn't hear much, but it wasn't good. Something about papers, secrets, and a farm. Agatha noted every word, letting it sink in. She had suspected Leonard had uncovered something tied to Carsely's past, but now there was confirmation. Someone had met him privately, someone he trusted enough to share fragments of a discovery. Who was it? She asked, pressing gently. His hands trembled harder, and his eyes flicked toward the hidden letter again. I can't say. I shouldn't. His voice was strained, small panic creeping in. Agatha could see the conflict etched across his face. The desire to help weighed against fear of naming names. Cedric, she said softly, stepping closer, your fear is understandable, but if you withhold what you know, someone could be hurt. Leonard is gone, and the person he trusted might still be in danger. You need to tell me, just enough to help stop more trouble. He shook his head again, lips pressed tight, and Agatha noticed the subtle quiver in his jaw. The bruise, the hidden letter, the fear, everything pointed to a secret too large for one person to carry safely. Finally, he exhaled a long, shuddering breath. I saw Leonard I saw him, but I didn't touch anything. I just watched. That's all I can say. Please, Mrs. Raisin, you don't want me involved further. Agatha nodded, understanding the delicate balance between fear and protection. She would tread carefully, but this was a crucial piece. Leonard had interacted with someone who mattered, someone dangerous, someone the villagers preferred to keep silent. As she left the house, her mind catalogued every detail: the bruise, the hidden letter, Cedric's terror. Each element was a thread, a clue woven into a pattern of secrecy and risk. Agatha Raisin felt the familiar thrill of the hunt sharpen in her chest. Danger was close, and the next steps had to be precise. The quiet street of Carsely seemed deceptively peaceful as she walked away, but in her mind the pieces were beginning to fit, and the shadow of the truth was inching ever closer.
The afternoon sun slanted through the vicarage windows as Agatha entered, carrying the latest notes she'd collected from the farm and Cedric's house. The vicar's wife greeted her with a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and Agatha immediately noticed the tension in the lines around her mouth. "Mrs. Bloxby," Agatha began gently, "I've been piecing together Leonard's activities. I think you may know more than you've said." The woman stiffened, her hands clasping tightly around a small, sealed envelope on the table. She looked at it as if it were a live creature, and Agatha followed her gaze. I wasn't sure if I should tell you," Mrs. Bloxby said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you have a way of finding truths that people would rather keep hidden. Leonard came to me yesterday afternoon before the book club. He was troubled, frightened even. He sought my advice." Agatha pulled a chair closer, leaning forward. "Advice about what?" Mrs. Bloxby drew a slow breath, as though preparing herself. "It wasn't about his death. It was about morality, ethics, the right thing to do in a very delicate situation. Another villager, someone he trusted, or he thought he could trust, was hiding something important. Leonard felt torn. He wanted to act honorably, but feared the consequences." Agatha's mind raced. Every clue she'd gathered now seemed to orbit around this unnamed villager. "And you advised him?" Mrs. Bloxby admitted, eyes downcast. "I did. I told him to speak the truth, to confront the person with honesty, believing it would resolve the matter without harm. I didn't consider the danger he might face. I thought it harmless." Her hand shook slightly, the envelope quivering between her fingers. Now I wonder if my advice led him straight into it, if my words nudged him toward something he wasn't prepared to handle." Agatha reached across the table,
placing a steadying hand over hers. "You didn't send him into danger. Leonard was cautious, intelligent, but yes, he trusted you, and that trust shaped his actions. It's not your fault, not really, but it does give us an important lead." The vicar's wife nodded, taking a slow, shuddering breath. "The villager he confronted, I shouldn't even say the name. It's delicate, but you must understand. Leonard believed in fairness, in justice, even in small things. He thought a wrong could be set right if only someone spoke up." Her gaze flicked to the envelope again. "There's a letter here he wanted me to keep safe. He said it contained guidance, or proof, perhaps. I've never opened it. I haven't dared." Agatha studied the envelope. Its paper was thick, the seal intact, unmarked by fingerprints except Mrs. Bloxby's own careful handling. "We'll leave it for now. We may need it later, but your insight is the real clue. Leonard's concern, his visit to you, it tells me someone in this village holds the secret worth protecting or fearing, and that secret may have cost him his life." The vicar's wife's shoulders sagged, relief and guilt mingling in her expression. "I only meant to guide him, to help him navigate right from wrong. I never imagined it could lead to this." Agatha gave her a reassuring smile, firm and steady. "Sometimes, even the best advice has unforeseen consequences, but we'll use what you've told me to uncover the truth and to make sure Leonard's efforts weren't wasted. He deserves that." The vicar's wife nodded, taking comfort in Agatha's determination. For the first time since Leonard's death, her shoulders seemed to ease, though the shadow of fear lingered. Agatha made a silent vow. She would follow every thread, every whisper, until the mystery was resolved. As she left the vicarage, the envelope still sealed and untouched, Agatha's mind was alive with possibilities. The villager Leonard had confronted remained unnamed, but now the path was clearer. Each secret, each moral choice, each hesitation mattered, and Agatha Raisin intended to uncover them all, no matter what it took.
Chapter 7. Clarity in the Quiet Hours. Agatha returned to her cottage as dusk settled over Carsely. The village bathed in a soft, amber glow. Inside, she closed the door carefully, ensuring the quiet enveloped her like a protective cocoon. She spread the collected documents across her kitchen table, pages from Leonard's cottage, torn letters from the abandoned farm, notes from Cedric, and her own meticulous observations. Each fragment of information felt like a brushstroke in a larger, unfinished painting. She began reviewing them systematically, as she always did when a puzzle demanded patience. A timeline emerged. Leonard's visits, the book club meeting, the private conversation with Mrs. Bloxby, Cedric's observations. Agatha noticed subtle inconsistencies. One detail she had missed earlier, the exact moment Leonard had left his home before the club, didn't quite match Cedric's account of someone meeting him in the alley. The difference was small, but to Agatha, such minutiae often held the key. She examined the notes again, looking for patterns, names circled repeatedly, references underlined, scribbles indicating urgency. One detail in particular caught her eye: Harold Craven's name, written on multiple documents, and the torn bookmark, always linked to a specific property, the abandoned farm. But the documents suggested something more. Harold Craven was not merely a historical figure or a distant name in Leonard's research. Someone alive in Carsely feared that name, its association, and the secrets it represented. Agatha leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. The pieces began to converge. The timeline inconsistencies, the carefully hidden letters, and the shadows of fear all pointed toward a single individual. This person had manipulated appearances, kept Leonard under observation, and tried to steer suspicion away. Their anxiety, their evasiveness, their subtle attempts to influence others, they were no longer merely curious behaviors. They were signs of guilt. She picked up her notebook, jotting down the sequence of events, the overlooked clues, and the critical observation that had gone unnoticed.
a folded corner in one of Leonard's annotated books, aligned with a note Mrs. Bloxby had hesitated to mention. The convergence was undeniable. Agatha leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea, the warmth grounding her as her mind raced through the implications. She now knew where the next step would take her, and the path forward was clear. Leonard had uncovered something significant, and the person who had feared exposure most had left enough traces for her to follow. The quiet hours settled around her, carrying the scent of tea and parchment, but Agatha's mind was alive with the thrill of revelation. A single suspect had emerged from the shadows, and the final pieces of the puzzle were within reach.
The moon hung low over Carsely, casting pale light across the quiet streets as Agatha made her way toward the suspect's house. Her footsteps were soft on the gravel, deliberate and cautious. The village was still, the gentle hum of distant evening activity muted by darkness. Every instinct told her this visit needed care. She had a suspicion to confirm, and patience would be key. The front door was unlocked, as if inviting her in, though she knew better than to assume it was accidental. Agatha slipped inside, careful not to make a sound, and the familiar scent of the suspect's home greeted her, warm, domestic, and faintly perfumed. But beneath it, a subtle trace of Leonard's herbal tea blend tickled her senses, and she froze. That same blend had been in the book club, in the teacup that had startled her days ago. Agatha moved silently through the sitting room, scanning the shelves and drawers. Then she saw it, the missing drawer. It sat partially open in a corner, as though abandoned in haste. She knelt, inspecting its contents. Torn papers, some marked with Leonard's neat annotations, others scribbled in hasty, irregular handwriting, were stacked inside. Agatha carefully lifted a sheet and read fragments aloud in her mind, references to old agreements, unresolved property disputes, and warnings about secrets best left buried. Everything Leonard had been pursuing, the mystery he'd chased so diligently, was here. She stepped back, cataloging the evidence in her mind. The connection was undeniable. The missing book from the club's shelf, the unsent letters, the circled properties, even the torn bookmark, they all led to this room. Whoever kept these documents hidden had the strongest motive, the deepest fear of exposure. A soft creak echoed from the hallway. Agatha froze, heart steady despite the sudden awareness that the suspect had returned. A shadow appeared in the doorway, hesitant, suspicious. The suspect's eyes widened as they took in her presence, and Agatha calmly lowered her gaze toward the drawer and the scattered papers. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said evenly, "but I believe you know why I'm here. The missing drawer, Leonard's research, it all points to you." The suspect's lips moved as if to speak. Hesitation etched across their face. Their hands fidgeted, and Agatha noticed the tremor in their fingers. A confession seemed to hover on the brink of their mouth, unspoken yet palpable. A sudden noise, a loose shutter banging against the wall outside, broke the tension. The suspect flinched, but Agatha remained calm, her composure a deliberate anchor. "You don't need to speak loudly," she said gently. "I see what you've been hiding. I see the fear, the rationalization. The lengths you went to cover it. Leonard uncovered a truth you wanted to remain buried." The suspect's gaze flicked to the papers, to the drawer, to the teacup, still faintly scented. Their breath hitched, and Agatha took a step closer, voice firm but patient. "It's done now. You can explain, or the evidence will speak for itself, but I need to understand your motive, why you felt compelled to act, to conceal, to manipulate events around Leonard's discovery." For a tense moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint wind rattling the window panes. Then the suspect exhaled sharply, shoulders sagging in reluctant surrender. Their confession hung in the air, almost spoken, almost relieved. Agatha noted every nuance, the fear, the rationalization, the hesitation. She allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "The truth matters. Leonard pursued it,
So must we. The secrets hidden here are no longer safe, and it's time they were faced. Outside, the moon continued its quiet vigil over Carsely, but inside, the shadows in the room had shifted. Agatha Raisin had uncovered the final piece, and the path to resolution was finally within reach.
Chapter 8. Truth at the Book Club Table. Agatha arrived at the familiar book club room, carrying a small stack of papers and a calm determination. The villagers had gathered, murmuring quietly, their expressions a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and the faint amusement that always accompanied Agatha's investigations. At the center of the room sat the suspect, attempting to appear casual, though the tension radiating from them was palpable. "Thank you all for coming," Agatha began, her voice even and measured. "I believe it's time to make sense of the events that have unsettled our village these past days." She placed the papers carefully on the table, spreading them out so that everyone could see the evidence: pages from Leonard's notes, torn letters, and the bookmark with its faint indentations. She started at the beginning, calmly recounting Leonard's final days, his visit to Mrs. Bloxby, the questions he raised, the research he conducted at his cottage, and the mysterious activity at the abandoned farm. The villagers listened intently, some leaning forward, others glancing at each other, the hum of anticipation filling the room. Leonard discovered something that involved not just forgotten property disputes, but a series of decisions made years ago, kept hidden by one person who feared exposure. She let her gaze sweep across the room, pausing meaningfully on the suspect, whose fingers fidgeted nervously. She detailed the chain of evidence: the missing drawer found in the suspect's home, the torn pages and letters, and the repeated references to Harold Craven and the unsent correspondence meant to conceal the truth. Each fragment was placed carefully in context, the sequence of events laid bare with precision. Every hesitation, every act of secrecy points to someone who wished these truths never to be uncovered. Leonard, in his determination to be honest and thorough, threatened to expose what had been hidden. Her voice remained steady, but the weight of her words pressed the room into silence. The suspect's facade began to crack. Their lips parted as if to speak, then closed again, guilt and panic flickering across their face. It wasn't meant to go that far," they blurted, their voice sharp, defensive. "I only wanted to protect myself. I never imagined." Agatha nodded slightly, her expression calm. "And yet, your attempts to hide the past, to manipulate what Leonard might find, set events in motion that could not be stopped. The evidence is clear. The motive, while understandable in its fear, does not absolve the actions taken to conceal the truth." The villagers shifted in their seats, some gasping quietly, others whispering to one another. Mrs. Bloxby pressed her hands to her lips, her eyes glistening with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Agatha caught her glance, noting the subtle nod as if the vicar's wife silently acknowledged both Leonard's integrity and the painful clarity of the situation. Agatha paused, allowing the room to absorb the final pieces. "Leonard acted with honor," she said softly, "even when faced with threats and uncertainty. And now, with the truth revealed, we can face these matters openly, learn from past mistakes, and begin to heal." A few villagers nodded, some murmuring their agreement, while others exchanged hesitant looks. The suspect sank into the chair, shoulders slumping, resigned yet relieved that the secrecy could no longer persist. Agatha looked around the room, her gaze settling finally on the empty space where Leonard should have been. She thought of the meticulous notes, the torn letters, and the determination that had driven him. His efforts had brought clarity, and now the village could see the threads of deception unraveled, laid bare in the light of honesty. The room, once tense with uncertainty, now held a sense of closure. The villagers' murmurs softened, the weight of suspicion lifted. Agatha Raisin allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The puzzle had been solved, the mystery laid out in plain view, and the village, for all its quirks and secrets, could finally breathe easy again.
The morning sun bathed Carsely in a soft, golden light, and for the first time in several days, the village seemed truly at peace. Agatha strolled down the familiar lanes, noting the gentle bustle of shopkeepers opening their stores and neighbors exchanging pleasantries. The air carried the faint scent of baking bread and fresh earth, comforting in its ordinary rhythm. After days of secrets and tension, the calm felt almost luxurious. She paused outside the vicarage, where Mrs. Bloxby was arranging flowers on the doorstep. The older woman looked up and smiled, a warmth in her eyes that had been absent during the week's troubling events. Agatha approached, her footsteps soft on the cobblestones. "Good morning, Mrs. Bloxby," Agatha said gently. "I wanted to check on you. How are you feeling after everything?" Mrs. Bloxby's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the blooms. "Much better, thank you, Agatha. I was so afraid I had somehow led Leonard into danger, but now I see that it was his courage, his honesty that mattered most. You helped uncover the truth, and I cannot thank you enough." Agatha smiled reassuringly. "None of this was your fault. You only gave advice in good faith. Leonard made his own choices, and ultimately it is our own actions that shape the outcomes we face." She placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Bloxby's shoulder. "You did your best, and that is what counts." The vicar's wife nodded, relief evident in her expression. They shared a quiet moment, standing together in the warm morning light, the hum of the village around them soft and comforting. The sense of community, even after a crisis, felt remarkably resilient. Later, Agatha returned to the book club room, where the group had reconvened. The tables were once again set with delicate china, biscuits neatly arranged, and the familiar scent of Earl Grey tea filling the air. Conversations were gentle, punctuated by soft laughter and the occasional comment about the latest novels. The tension of the past week had dissolved, replaced by a comforting normality. Agatha moved through the room, exchanging small smiles and polite remarks. She noticed that the missing book had returned to its rightful place, and the old bookmark was carefully tucked away in the club's collection. Each detail reinforced the return to everyday life, the ordinary pleasures of friendship, reading, and shared conversation. As the afternoon waned, Agatha took her leave, deciding on a quiet walk home. The streets were peaceful, with the sun casting long shadows across the cottages and gardens. She reflected on the peculiar comfort of village life, how a place could seem tranquil and orderly on the surface, yet hold secrets and dangers just beneath. It was precisely this duality that made life in Carsely both soothing and endlessly intriguing. Arriving at her front door, she noticed an envelope resting on the mat, delivered without fanfare. Curious, she picked it up and examined it. No name marked the outside, only a delicate emblem she didn't recognize. A faint shiver of anticipation ran through her. Perhaps the next adventure was already beginning, quietly, subtly, in the heart of her village. Glancing up, she caught a fleeting movement behind a window across the street. A villager watched her, silently, curious or cautious. It was impossible to tell. Agatha tucked the envelope under her arm, smiled faintly, and unlocked the door. Inside, she set her belongings down and poured a cup of tea, savoring the warmth. The room was quiet, safe, and filled with the familiar comforts she so appreciated. Outside, Carsely carried on, oblivious to the small but meaningful ripple of events that had unfolded. Agatha settled into her chair, content to watch the evening unfold through the window, feeling both the serenity of the present and the subtle promise of mysteries yet to come. Even in the calmest corners of Carsely, she knew adventure always lingered, patient, quiet, and waiting for someone perceptive enough to notice, and Agatha Raisin, as always, was ready.